Well, Tom, it's June 2020, and Vino Veritas Society is underway. Chapter meetings are happening, and we have all of these big things that we want to talk about. We have policies that we'd like to get into. We have different subjects about constitutionality and the purpose of government and everything else. And it seems like the world today is requiring us to have this whole conversation just about what the basic ideas are. So before we start getting into podcasts down the road of all of that, I think it's time we have a very basic conversation, first and foremost, about what's going on in the world, and that's racism, right? We have this question of, is there racism out there?
I was going to say, let's be clear here, right? It's a question of, is it racism going on, or is it discussions about racism?
Fair. So if we talk about the discussions of racism, we have a real issue. We are seeing people taking a knee like Colin Kaepernick started a few years ago, and all of a sudden this guy who was somewhat of an outlier, now we're seeing Nancy Pelosi and other Democrat senators and congressmen taking a knee on the steps of the Hill. Yep. We're seeing National Guardsmen taking a knee in what they're calling solidarity. And we have a basic conversation that there are people saying that this country has a systemic problem of racism.
In fact, I think one of the most succinct statements I've seen of that sentiment is by the primary author of the 1619 Project, that big effort launched by the New York Times. The way she stated it is that racism is in the DNA of the United States, meaning it's inseparable. To be an American is to be racist.
And what's amazing that you bring that up is I was actually watching a news show this morning where one of the guest commentators said we haven't had a systemic racism problem in this country since the Republican Party was founded. We haven't had a systemic problem about racism in this country since the Democrat Party was founded. We've had a systemic problem about racism in this country for 401 years, according to this.
401.
401. Specifically 401. Yeah. It's June 2020. What does that say?
Yeah, that leads right back to 1619, right? Buying into the whole 1619 Project.
Right. So, and our audience might not all know what the 1619 Project is. If we want to maybe just go into a little bit of detail on what they're talking about.
I'll summarize it. This was launched a little less than a year ago. It was August of 2019. It's a project by the New York Times, and it consists of a number of lengthy essays, videos. Now they are, of course, they're going into the realm of education. They're taking the materials and turning it into curriculum for schools. But here's the gist of it. It's titled the 1619 Project because the year 1619 was the year the first black African slaves arrived on the shores of North America. Now, keep in mind, it was then British North America. There were a handful of British colonists there, but their argument is that the dating of the American founding, I mean, this is a quite audacious thing they're attempting to do. They're saying the dating of the American founding should be changed from 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was written, to 1619, because it is the arrival of black slaves that is the real characteristic, the real meaning, the real essence of what the United States became.
So we have the 1619 Project being put together in the United States. We've got all of these other things happening, and we've got a lot of people out there claiming that there is systemic racism inherent in the United States of America. And I have to ask the question, and I keep asking the question to everybody I can ask. Is it that America is racist, or is it that there are some Americans who might be racist?
Right.
And when we talk about a systemic problem of racism in this country, does that mean that's all these people who want to throw out the Declaration of Independence, who want to throw out the Constitution? And as we talked about in the last podcast, our whole goal here is to turn the country back towards the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. If we're going to turn that ship around, I think we need to spend some time before we can get into all of these really interesting conversations down the road about the different powers that the government has given itself and the growth of the bureaucracy and all of these things that are hugely unconstitutional that we as the Vino Veritas Society want to change. I think we need to have a basic conversation about clarifying, at the very least, that moving the country back in the direction of the Declaration of Independence is the farthest thing from moving the country back towards what some people would say a racist idea.
Yeah, well, in fact, what it really means is moving the country toward the solution of racism. That's what it really means. To move towards the declaration is to move towards the solution. Here's what I would like to do, is I'd like to sort of divide our conversation into two big main subjects. Let's talk about racism. Well, first of all, let's explain what racism is. And let's talk about racism and the rest of the world. How has this subject been, has it existed? Has it been a problem anywhere else in the world over the last, say, 5,000 or 6,000 years? And then after saying a few words about the rest of the world, let's talk about the United States. And we should probably offer a definition here, because these terms are so charged and people are quite emotional and passionate about them. What I understand by racism is the premise of it is the very flawed, the very incorrect, inaccurate, philosophic, scientific doctrine from the 19th century that humanity, is divided into distinct races. Now, it's hard to find a scientist today who would actually agree with that, but that was the argument back in the 1800s, that humanity is divided into different races, and some races are superior intellectually, morally, culturally, just by the DNA in their own cells. And so it's proper for certain races to be socially and politically superior, that there should be a social hierarchy with the superior races lording over the inferior races. And someone who believes that and believes that their race is superior to others, that is a racist. That's my understanding of racism. Is that similar to how you understand this?
It is. I'd even add something to it. And I'm only adding this because I want those people listening to this who think that we don't understand why Colin Kaepernick is taking a knee, right? I'm not going to get into the him taking a knee is an insult to our troops, or it's an insult to our flag, right? That's sort of the common counter argument to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. I want people to understand that we actually do understand he's fighting back against schools that have inequality in comparison to other schools in other parts of cities. He's talking about things like crime bills that someone we know in major politics right now, Joe Biden, was actually the author of during the Clinton administration.
Right.
And different things that have been put out that have led to problems of inequality within our society in terms of the way people are treated, right? It's the lack of equal application of the law.
It's worth adding here that, racism, the ism, it's an opinion, it's an attitude. I happen to think it's a deeply mistaken, flawed, because it's impossible to generalize an entire group of people by some arbitrary characteristic like race. Within any group of people, what you find is a whole spectrum, right? You find some who are really smart and some who are less, and that's true of any large group of people. But the racism it's an opinion, it's an attitude. In itself, it's not an injustice, right? If someone sits on their front porch watching people walk by and think, I hate that person because he's a member of a certain race or a certain group, and I hate that other person because that's a member of some other group I don't like. And that person's sitting there thinking that in his head. That in itself is not harming someone. It's right. It's not violating anyone else's rights. It's not stealing anything from anybody. It's not stopping anyone from doing anything. It's someone with an opinion. Now, the minute that person gets up and picks up a weapon, for example, and goes out and actually hurts someone who hasn't done anything, is just a member of some group, now we have a problem. Now an injustice has been done, and that's when the criminal law is supposed to get involved, because someone has just violated the rights of someone else.
And that applies to everybody.
That's right.
This is not a only if citizens do it, but not if government does it. We should be holding government to the same accountability that if a member of the government, and in any capacity.
And I'll also add to this, since we at the Vino Veritas Society are very much in favor of a free society, we're in favor of government with very limited constitutionally directed powers. And so we tend to be critics of the big, massive regulatory administrative state we have today, this big bloated government. And one of the many reasons we're critics of it is because government contains within itself all kinds of perverse incentives, incentives to fail, incentives, people, government employees, as we have seen in many cases, they can go out and not only fail to do their jobs, but actually hurt people and not always be held accountable. And so one of our messages is racism is incorrect, racism is dangerous, and it's especially dangerous when racism is in a great big government with virtually no limits on its powers.
Right. So for a conversation today, you were saying divide this into two parts, right? So let's start with the first part, and that is the
rest of the world.
The historical and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me that I can be watching a news program like I was this morning and hear someone say, racism has been a problem for 401 years. How does somebody actually sit there and believe and get the opportunity to address millions of Americans,
right,
and say racism's been a problem for 401 years?
Right. Well, they can do that when they don't know much about history, when they don't know much about their own country or how it relates to, how it compares to the rest of the world. So I'm going to summarize here because we're in a very brief podcast, but prior to 1776, prior to the American founding, every regime in history, of which I know, and I'm talking about thousands of years, spanning 5,000 years, regimes were tribal. There was a tribalism within every regime. It was based on either ethnicity or blood connection or some kind of tribal or clan-like affiliation. And it meant that within every regime, there were always groups of people who were not protected by the laws, who were not welcome to be citizen because they weren't part of the tribe, part of the clan. It means all prior regimes, prior to the American founding, they were regimes of systemic tribalism, systemic racism, systemic, however you want to call that, clanism, right? Where you have these clans and groups, and some are given perks and benefits and others are not. Some are protected by the laws and others are not. That's been the norm throughout all of human history, systemic tribalism. What would be remarkable when you're looking at that history, let's say you didn't know about the United States, you didn't know about the American founding. When you're looking through all these different forms of tribal regimes, what would be remarkable, what would be so hopeful is to think, could there be a regime founded upon the idea that every human being in the world has the same equal natural rights? Now, that would be a striking break with all of past history, and it would be a wonderful thing. It would be a beautiful thing. And it turns out there was a regime founded on that universal idea of human equality, that rejection of tribalism. It was the American founding. It's right there in our own Declaration of Independence.
Right. And I think if we go back and if we really look at it, one of the things we focus on as the Vino Veritas Society is natural rights, right? So we can talk about all of the different rights that different clans have had and clans have prohibited and everything else tribes have prohibited on people. But when you get down to the core, people who are really slaves, people who are really affected affected by racism are those who have had their natural, unalienable, truthful rights taken away from them. Their right to own violated. And we can go back in history for thousands of years and always find in every regime, groups of people have been told, you are not allowed to own property. You can't have a house.
That's right.
You cannot have anything, a roof over your head, unless somebody else who's allowed to own property decides to take you in. You can't own food. You can't grow a garden. You can't have property.
Think of the whole medieval feudal system, right? All throughout Europe, those medieval feudal regimes featured in every one. There was one true property owner, the sovereign, the king. Other than that, Everybody else was a tenant. It's where we get the word landlord that we use to we're someone who rents an apartment to somebody. We call them, that comes from medieval Europe and that idea that no one really owns their property because the king owes everything, and he'll tolerate some people to work some parts of his land in a way that he approves. And here I think it's important to point out two features that we tend to forget. One is that an idea, a principle, like the idea every human being has the same equal natural rights to their own freedom. Ideas, first of all, they have to be discovered. Some mind has to pause and actually think about it, right? We're not born with these ideas. When we're babies, we don't know these things. Somebody's got to figure them out. And then number two, in order for them to have some sort of cultural or social or political influence, they have to be spread. People who discover an idea have to teach others, and they have to teach yet others. So we sit here today in June of 2020, and most modern Americans think racism is bad, racial injustice is a problem to be solved. We agree with that. How did it come that so many people think racial injustice is bad? Well, it's because a lot of people became aware of this idea of universal equal individual rights. Well, why weren't people aware of that 1,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago? Why are they aware of it now? Because we had this amazing event called the American Revolution, right? The American founding that was based on this idea, and we proclaimed it to the world. We put it in our Declaration of Independence. We used to talk about it in our speeches. Other people around the world used to repeat and read from our Declaration of Independence. I like to tell the story about those students in Tiananmen Square, that horrific event that happened in China. More than 200 years after the American founding. And what were those students reading there? Those Chinese students didn't look like Americans, didn't speak English, right? They had no cultural connection. They were reading the Declaration of Independence because they said these ideas are universal. They apply to us just as much as to everyone else. That means the influence of the United States in the world, that's a beautiful influence. That's a wonderful thing.
And let's not forget that even today in Hong Kong, as those protesters are fighting for their liberty from communist China, they're still waving American flags. People who are still facing dictatorships and tyranny and threats to their lives and liberty and property and pursuit of happiness are still waving those American flags.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, this is sort of a subtle philosophic point, but it's so important. If you think of a really bad, really unjust kind of regime, some ancient regime, think of ancient Rome under Nero, or in more modern times, think of something like Nazi Germany. If you have a regime whose very purpose is injustice, right? The regime, the people who found it and formed the government, they say our purpose is to divide people into groups and harm certain groups. That's what we're all about. That's our goal. Then for those people, racism, they don't see racism as a problem. They don't see slavery as a problem. They don't see death camps as a problem. They see it as a fulfillment of their purpose, of their mission. They see it as something to be encouraged. Nazi Germans encouraged racial, degrading racist comments about Jews, about gypsies, about anyone who disagreed with the Nazi political agenda.
Right.
They didn't see that racism as a bad thing. What kind of environment do you find many people agreeing that racism is bad? An environment infused with the idea of equality, the idea of universal natural equality. When that idea spreads throughout a culture, a society, those are people who start to become aware of injustices, and they start to say, hey, we now understand this idea of equality properly understood, so we think slavery is bad and we need to get rid of it. We think racial injustice is bad and we need to get rid of it. All of this is to say, this country, it doesn't have racism in its DNA. It's not inherently racist. It means we should solve injustices by living up to and embracing our own principles.
Right. So that brings us back to the second point you were getting to. And that second point is we have this somehow juxtaposition that is hypocritical from my perspective that we've established in this country among the protesters and the people out there taking a knee, the people looking for something that they can do to make themselves feel better, posting black squares on Instagram. That the answer to all of this is more government, right? So something you and I talk about constantly is this idea that nobody's perfect. We're human beings, right? We have beast in us, we have reason in us, and we're somewhere in the middle. And all of us are somewhere in the middle.
If someone might want to know what you mean by having beast in us, we have like instincts, right? We have appetites like the beasts. Yeah.
Sure. So and for those guardians and members of the guild, that's an important part of your toolbox videos that go back and check that out, because we have gone into some detail on that. So the idea here to say that we're going to grow the government as a method of protecting people from the imperfections of people in government, the hypocrisy there. I don't understand the rationale.
Yeah, well, and I want to come at from slightly different angles. Same point though. Whenever we see these instances where, some cop or some small number of cops do something terrible, and they do. There are instances where they do these unforgivable, horrifically unjust, heinous actions. When these happen, very often many people are quick to respond and say, well, there's just a few bad apples. Most cops or most government employees in general are pretty good. And I think it's important to clarify, in terms of personal character, if you take a large sample of government employees and a large sample of private business employees, you know what you're going to find? The same thing. Yeah. You're going to find some really good eggs. You're going to find some really bad eggs. You're going to find some who are really smart, some who are not so smart, some who are real ambitious and creative, others who are... You're just going to find a big spectrum. The difference comes from the incentives. Government presents people, employees, with a very different set of incentives than, say, a private business. That cop in Minneapolis who was kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck for, what was it, eight and a half minutes, almost 9 minutes, and killed him. That cop has been brought up time and time and time again. I think a dozen times, something like that. He's been involved in incidents where complaints have been leveled, including shootings and other things. Now, if you were an employee at a business and you went and shot one of the customers or picked up one of the customers and threw him down or knelt on his neck, right, you would instantly be fired.
Right.
There's only one institution where you find employees treating people like this, and yet they don't get fired. They still get promotions and raises. That's government. It is filled with perverse incentives. And that's why we actually want to reduce the realm of government, the sphere of government, as small as possible, so that we have as few government employees acting under those, knowing it's still going to be a perverse incentives, but at least it'll be smaller and the damage won't be as great.
And in either circumstance, if we bring this back to racism and the conversation around racism, in either circumstance, in the government sector, it doesn't matter if the person is black, white, brown, anything else. It doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. It doesn't matter anything else. They're going to be treated with certain protections. And in the private sector, it doesn't matter what the person looks like, what the person's background is. If you harm a customer, you're going to be fired.
That's right.
It doesn't matter. So this idea of racism. So let's close this out. Let's spend the last few minutes of this really focused on the difference in solutions. And let's go back to the Declaration. Let's go back to what it says and what Lincoln eventually said about it, and talk about some of those things that have led us to form this society with the purpose of driving us back to the words of the Declaration of Independence, knowing that ourselves, we know that is the best way to actually handle some of these problems that a lot of people right now are trying to claim our systemic problems. The problem is the solutions. The problem is, are we talking about solutions from a growing government standpoint, or are we talking about problems by actually understanding what America is about and understanding that racism in general when it does exist, is completely separate from the system of government of America.
Yeah, in fact, I would put it this way. Where there is racial injustice, one finds a betrayal of the principles of America. In other words,
Yes.
not a fulfillment of the principles, a betrayal. That cop who murdered Mr. Floyd, that cop was violating and betraying the principles of this regime. He wasn't living up to them. He wasn't acting in accordance with them. And that might be the key thing to remember about why this country is not systemically racist, because it's built on an idea that is the solution to racism. It means we should move closer to our founding principles and embrace them, not mock them, not ignore them. Don't run around. There's a movement now. I don't know how serious it is, but people are, I don't know if it's all women, they're shaving their heads. And, if you want to shave your head as a form of protest against the police injustice, I guess. I don't know what that's going to do. I don't know that solves any of the problem. But here is a solution. I wanted to read, I have in front of me a speech from Lincoln. And he delivered this in the summer of 1858. Just before he was about to launch his famous debates with Stephen Douglas. And he gave this speech right around the 4th of July, Independence Day. So he was talking about that date, the 4th of July, and what it represents. And he points out that while some Americans, again, this is 1858, so this is 75 years roughly after the Declaration. And he says, there are some citizens among us who actually have blood connection to the founding generation. But already by 1858, the vast majority did not. Their parents or grandparents had immigrated to the United States after the founding, and they were not blood related. And he's talking about that group who is not blood related to the founders. And what he says is so relevant and important for us today. This is Lincoln. He said, if they, meaning those children of immigrants, if they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days of the Revolution by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find those old men said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." And then they feel that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so they are, right? It's beautiful. They are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh, not because of who their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents were, because they embrace that beautiful idea in the Declaration of Independence. He finishes this paragraph by saying, that is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. There's the answer to our problems today. Embrace, move towards, live up to the ideas of universal natural rights, universal natural equality, universal natural justice enshrined in our own Declaration of Independence.
It's amazing that it can be so simple. It really is, right? I mean, everybody is searching for answers, and everybody's out there saying we need to come up with answers to racial injustice. And I'm not going to sit here and claim that there isn't racial injustice in the world. But here's what I will claim. I will claim that it is almost entirely because we've empowered government to create racial injustice. Mm-hmm. And if we want to actually fix this problem. If anybody listening to this who is out there saying, how do we actually address the concerns, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or Nancy Pelosi or anybody in between, right? And they have very little in common.
That's right.
But if you want to address any of those problems, the solution is never going to be, let's keep adding Band-Aids on top of this in government.
Lincoln pointed out, in a way you could say the grossest, most heinous form of racial injustice, the in-your-face racial injustice, was the practice of legalized slavery. And Lincoln's whole purpose was to encourage Americans to change their policies, change their laws to align with the principles of the Declaration, which would mean abolishing laws that protect slavery. And he pointed out, he said, slavery could not exist in the United States, not one day, not 1 hour, not 1 minute, without government laws protecting it. Because slave owners would not be able to command and control their slaves. It required a government issuing laws, issuing policies that violate the principles of the Declaration. And so in all of this, it's crucial to remember that racism, racial injustice, they're wrong precisely because they violate the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which are self-evident truths. It is true that every human being has a natural rightful claim to himself, to his own freedom, to his own property. And that's why racial injustice and all other forms of injustice, any kind of murder, any kind of theft, any kind of assault is unjust and wrong because those principles, those ideas are true. So let's not mock those ideas. Let's not throw them away. Let's enshrine them into our own modern practices and policies.
And I think it's worth wrapping up with remembering the basic fact that you talked about it earlier. Slavery existed in this world in various forms. Racial injustice existed in various forms for thousands of years on this planet, all over the place, in every regime. And from the moment that the United States Declaration of Independence was written, from the moment the Constitution was signed, 75 years, couple That's generations, right. and Lincoln led a civil war to protect those ideas, and we set the world on a course towards the extinction of slavery in a way that had never been done before. And to say that the United States is systemically racist when we were able to achieve something in such a short period of time,
That's right.
after centuries, it is just awe-inspiring.
I like to say that in the United States, slavery became a huge social problem, a huge cultural problem, and eventually became a political problem, and it became a problem worth making a war over before the ink was dried on the Declaration of Independence, because those ideas in the Declaration and slavery are incompatible with each other. And a whole lot of Americans, not all, but a whole lot of Americans started to reflect on that. Wow, those ideas are true, so this practice of slavery must be wrong and we have to get rid of it. That had never happened in any country, in any regime, anywhere in the world, because there had never been a regime based on those ideas. That is the refutation of the claim that America is systemically racist. It is systemically beautiful if we will only live up to our own ideas.
Which is why we live by our tagline, No Sumos Custodes. We are the guardians.
We are the guardians.
We will forever guard that idea because that is the most beautiful and that is the most free opportunity we could have. And with that, unless you have any other comments, I think we'll continue this conversation next time.
I'm going to sign us. No Sumos Custodes.